Most people were in the last session, but just in case, my name's Heather Marquette. I'm Professor of Development Politics at the University of Birmingham, and I'm seconded part-time to DFID as a Senior Research Fellow in Governance and Conflict. And this work actually comes out of some stuff I've been doing for Peter and the team around thinking about future research needs. If you could see my slides, you would see I've got some great original artwork in here from an artist in the team who is in no way in this room. But hopefully, if we can get it up there, you'll be able to see it. The paper today represents very preliminary work. Okay. And it's really about starting a conversation about, if we're thinking about organized crime and development, how do we need to do that? And how do we need to do it in a way that's cognizant of some of the things we were just talking about in the last plenary? So the presentation today, I'm going to start with, well, why should development researchers and policymakers be interested in organized crime? I'm going to use a Janus perspective to talk through how we need to think differently about the connections between licit and illicit, legal and illegal activities. Going to focus on Ghana, which might come as a surprise to some of you because Ghana is a very stable country and not one that you necessarily associate with problems like serious organized crime, but hopefully to show you through it as an atypical case why this is something we really need to be urgently focusing on. And it's interesting in itself.
Which one are you using?
Oh,
this
on this one. My notes are on here, so I'll use
right,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. And with that, sort of thinking about how a TWP perspective can help us actually think through some of the things I just mentioned about unintended consequences and do no harm, which I think become very vivid when you talk about organized crime in the same way as when you talk about conflict, for example, and just provide some ideas about a potential future research agenda. Okay, so why should we care about organized crime? So it is absolutely, as somebody who's worked on corruption for 20 years, and we still talk constantly about how you measure corruption, it's impossible to accurately measure organized crime in terms of the scope and the scale. So I just wanted to give you a small number of examples, quite random, just to show you the sorts of things that we might be thinking about. So recently the Chancellor called serious organized crime the most deadly national security threat faced by the UK, costing the nation at least 37 billion each year. The UK's National Crime Agency estimates that money laundered through the City of London is in the hundreds of billions a year. It distorts the property markets, it undermines security, all of these sorts of things. And that is in a country with, until recently, a very strong governance sector. The team at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime have done some fantastic political analysis in recent years, and they've written some great things around West Africa and drugs trafficking. And in a couple of really provocative papers, they talk about the connections between politics and drugs trafficking in the region. You know, the Mauritania, the nephew of the former president and a former chief of Interpol, arrested for drugs trafficking. In Morocco, the son of the former president, arrested. Burkina Faso, the former president, arrested. And in Guinea-Bissau, it is just far too many senior political leaders to even put on a slide, arrested for drugs trafficking. You could do that in East Africa, you could do that in all sorts of parts of the world as well. In Mexico, since 2006, over 100,000 people have been killed in drugs-related violence by organized crime. Estimated annual revenue for organized crime in 2016 was $890 million, which is pretty much double what it was a decade previous. Illicit trade in wildlife, 19 billion estimated, and worryingly it's bringing pastoralists into connection with organized crime gangs as well, so becoming part of their livelihood strategies. Recently there's been research about the shortage in sand and why that is a catastrophic problem globally. But sand, something new that I just learned, makes up 85% of extractives globally, but only a third of it is traded on legal markets. So that means an awful lot being traded illegal. And there's a great new paper about India, talking about the rise in sand mafias, which is not going to go down as sand becomes scarce. In Ghana, the African Center for Energy Policy estimates in 2013 alone $1.7 billion in illicit financial flows from illegal mining. So not legal mining, not all sectors or so on, but from that one small part of the economy, 1.7 billion. If you compare that to Ghana's total aid budget, which is 1.3 billion on average, it's pretty substantial. And as we discovered, Ghana is now in the top 10 of countries in terms of global cybercrime, and it's developing this really weird, unique political economy, a culture around cybercrime that's linked to its historical past and is really about setting up what one writer calls the new political normal of working with politicians to undermine aspects of the state. So in the paper, what I do, and this is in conversations between Peter and me, and this is I love this kind of open for business, open for badness. We were talking about how organized crime operates, and it's not as simple as the goodies and the baddies, that the two are so interconnected everywhere, here in the UK and in other countries, that you can't actually divide the licit and the illicit very easily. So it's not like two sides of the same coin. It's like Janus's two-face. They're two faces on the same side. If you try to destroy one, you're going to destroy the other. So how do you actually intervene effectively in this as well? However, the other side of it is also that it's not just about organized crime undermining development, taking money out of the public purse, violence, and so on. It's actually been called the dark side of globalization. All of the investments we put in to boosting the systems that support global trade and so on, ports and infrastructures and financial systems and internet access and so on, are also expanding opportunities for organized crime. So if you destroy organized crime, you're going to hurt legitimate businesses, people's jobs and livelihoods and so on. If you built infrastructure and so on without this in mind, you are going to be boosting organized crime. So how do you actually do that? And I love this quote here, organized crime is the dirty side of the sharp dollar. You should always try to remember that. So the paper has these two arguments. So attacking these illicit activities may damage licit ones, and development interventions encouraging growth are going to attract illicit characters as well. So what I've argued in it is that by bringing in a do no harm perspective for fighting organized crime, is it helps you to start to unpick some of these challenges and think about interventions in a way that you wouldn't necessarily do that way. And DFID is currently working on developing a crime sensitivity tool that brings that in, which I think is a really important intervention. It also helps us to think about the choices that are being made, whether to intervene or not, whether to tackle organized crime or not, and how to think about the growth interventions too. So, Ghana and organized crime. Like I said, it's not your first choice. Even in West Africa, it wouldn't be the most obvious choice. And that's because Ghana is a stable country, and it is very attractive in terms of licit investment. There's a stable government, it's a safe country, it's relatively good on corruption compared to a lot of its neighbors. It has its problems, but they're nowhere on the scale of most of its neighbors. It's a very good banking system. It has some of the highest internet connectivity in sub-Saharan Africa, and actually compared to countries in Latin America as well, very, very good connectivity. And it has good ports, roads, and all of that as well. So in 2015, it attracted foreign direct investment of $3 billion, again, compared to ODA, which is a drop in the bucket compared to that. However, these same characteristics also are attracting organized crime. You have this massive port and trade infrastructure that can be used for smuggling all sorts of things, from drugs, arms, wildlife, some really clever different ways that they do that we've heard about. The financial system helps facilitate money laundering. It has very porous borders on either side, in addition to the ocean border as well, which helps cross-border smuggling. And all of its internet access is turning it into a major cybercrime hub, whereas actually it's becoming, for younger people, it may eventually be seen as a employment of choice, in a sense. So I'd like to give a couple of examples to give a sense of the scale of the problem. And I really would like, yeah. Okay. So my favorite example actually from the paper isn't from Ghana, it's from Kenya. And it's the connections between organized crime, politics, and business. And there's an MP called Heron Mwao, who was a businessman. He was leading stakeholder in the region's biggest supermarket chain. He was head of the anti-corruption agency there. He was a funder of Kibaki's presidential campaign, and he was given assistant transport minister as a result, which gave him control over the ports and the container terminals as well. And with those, he became such a big drugs trafficker that he actually made it onto the U.S.'s Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act, and he was arrested for drugs trafficking, along with his girlfriend and partner as well. We haven't found anything quite like that for Ghana, but we do have some good examples. For example, an MP called Eric Emoatang, and this is one of those things where I didn't save the photo from the news thing, and now I can't find it, which I'm kicking myself for. But he was a drugs trafficker who was arrested and had his assets frozen and so on, but he used those funds to fund development activities within his constituency, and a lot of them. He financed roads and streets, he sponsored students and scholarships, he provided tractors for farmers, he provided interest-free loans, he supported the registration of voters, he gave awards for high-performing students and so on. Hugely popular. And when he was arrested, there were spontaneous protests in the street with constituents carrying placards saying cocaine or no cocaine, Emoatang is still our MP. And that tells you if you're arresting these criminals, there are these downstream effects that might be felt, including their popularity locally. The photo here is a Mercedes 6x6 that we saw when we were in Ghana, and it really stands out. And Oxford Street in Accra, the biggest, most popular shopping street, there are no other vehicles like this. And actually, once I looked around, as far as I can tell, there are two people in Ghana who own this vehicle. One is Suleiman Tare, the footballer, and the other is Ibrahim Mahama, the brother of the former president. So Mahama is a very successful businessman. He owns West Africa's largest concrete factory, he's mining, all sorts of different businesses. He's a huge philanthropist, and he claims to be Ghana's largest taxpayer. There is all sorts of reasons why he owns this vehicle, which, depending on which site you look at, is usually goes for about $1 million. However, he has faced constant allegations for corruption, harrowing, drugs trafficking, not in the least linked to the fact that he has control over some of the terminals in the airport, where he uses them to ship a lot of vehicles back and forth to Europe quite a bit without any scrutiny through an arrangement. However, the narcotics board there has not been able to find any evidence so far of him being a drugs trafficker, but these allegations keep coming up. So recently you see these sorts of headlines about, I'm a genuine businessman, I have no fear from the special prosecutor, different things like that. And the rumors have not gone away, despite his wealth and his philanthropy. A less obvious example that we heard was around microfinance. And there has been some work in the literature about microfinance and know your customer and so on. But as far as I know, there's no research on microfinance as a conduit for money laundering. And what we heard about in Ghana is increasingly microfinance being seen as a vehicle to launder funds. So you have some illegal funds, you invest those in a microfinance structure, and then the money gets washed out through the cash repayments at the end. And as Peter has said, that reputations also benefit from stain removal in this, because microfinance is seen as being an inherently good thing. So by laundering your money that way, you get the kudos as well as the money laundering. And even though there hasn't been any research that I've found so far, there are news reports coming out of India, Pakistan, Jamaica, and Nigeria, among others, where this may increasingly become a problem. But microfinance is not what you think of when you think of organized crime any more than sand was for me before the recent research. So why should we care about organized crime and development? If I haven't sold you already, this is a great map coming through a paper on crime and terrorism along China's Belt and Road. And you can see here, this is the crime and terrorist networks. And if I were to overlay the map of China's Belt and Road investments, they're all on here. So this is China's Belt and Road investments in sub-Saharan Africa, clearly linked to increasing trafficking around organized crime and terrorism as well, including our friends in Ghana, who are not escaping from the impact of this. He actually did this around the world, so I've just picked the one, but when you see it globally and when you see it regionally, it's one of the most terrifying things that I think I've seen in a while. So thinking about the paper, I mean, it draws on thinking and working politically research. It also draws a bit on research I've been doing with Karen Pfeiffer around corruption and anti-corruption interventions, and trying to think through how you would do anti-corruption work differently by focusing on the problems rather than the solutions led, in effect. The SOAS ACE and many of the Global Integrity ACE projects that you might have heard about here as well are very similar. So trying to step away from seeing this as we have solutions for tackling crime, we have solutions for tackling corruption, but actually trying to figure out what's going on and how do we think and work politically around that. So the first thing I would say with that is this move away from moralism. So moving away from thinking about these things in terms of goodies and baddies. And this is where the solutions comes in and partly why it comes in. So a presentation recently by Francesco Strazzari on serious organized crime in the Sahel. And he made the exact same point to say we have to move away from moralism. And because we need to see organized crime as a phenomenon operating through modes of governance, especially in spaces that are hard to govern. So he talked about upside-down governance, and most of the people here in this room will be familiar with that as a term in the development space as well. And in this, informal criminal activities are not necessarily the domain of thugs, but they're strategies for people in extremely resource-poor environments characterized by weak or non-existent governance to get by and to get what they need. And he talks about the Sahel as being a space almost devoid of governance, services, and all of the things that you need to work. And he talks very compellingly about how we need to actually at some point focus with the fact that people need services that they can rely on. Until that happens, you're going to see the persistence of these problems. And written very recently a paper coming out next month with Karen Pfeiffer again about in the anti-corruption space why and how we need to move away from moralism. The same lessons apply here. We're unlikely to find those solutions that actually work unless we can stop seeing this dichotomy here. We also want to talk a little bit about moving away from technical assistance that's completely unrooted in the political context. And this is another one of Peter's wonderful bits of artwork about how, it's not just all about the politics, it's not just all about the technical, the two have to come together. But actually convincing technical specialists that this is really important is a real challenge. Thinking in the organized crime space, you're dealing with law enforcement officials. Getting law enforcement officials to see this as a problem of prevention and not necessarily an issue of enforcement is going to be a hard sell, and getting them to talk about politics and what it actually means is another real challenge too. Okay. So what we want to do is to get people talking about actually interventions that can ease people towards the light rather than just punishing all the time. So that's a kind of whistle-stop tour of organized crime and development. So where are we hoping to take this? Right now, DFID is looking to commission some rapid evidence assessments or mapping to get a sense for, beyond the stuff we've been able to do. This is a hugely diverse field, most of which is not rooted in development literature. So law, criminology, political science, economics, anthropology, and so on. And to get a sense for where the evidence is strong and where it's weak and what we need to do. Peter and I have recently looked at all of the different research investments from this particular team in DFID, including ESID, ICTD, ACE, the whole lot here, and basically looked through to pull out anything. We're calling it vapor trails. Where can you see little hints of research that might be connected to organized crime? And can we get people together to start talking about the existing research around political settlements and so on to see if there are insights that we can take it from there? And from that, thinking about the potential for future research collaborations. And finally, thinking through what a possible large research investment in organized crime and development might look like and what it should be shaped as. So thank you.